Hello everyone and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing and advertising. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chin-wag with. It's like Pokemon Go with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards, co-founder and MD. Today, I've caught Richard Shotton. Richard is increasingly known as the author of The Choice Factory, a best-selling book on how to apply findings from behavioural science to advertising. But it would be wrong to dismiss Richard's impressive career as a media planner and publications of his work in the likes of AdMap, The Drum, and Marketing Week, to name just a few, which is where he first caught our eye. Richard is undoubtedly one of the smartest in the comms world, and I would urge everyone listening, regardless of industry, to pick up a copy of The Choice Factory. Significant praise for the book comes from various angles, including several of our heroes, Rory Sutherland, Dave Trott, Mark Ritson and Phil Barden, who referred to it as catnip for the industry. That's high praise, Richard. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Giles. Good to speak to you.
Now, to limber up the grey matter, we like to ask 7 quick-fire questions. So, Richard, coffee or tea?
Coffee, definitely.
Mac or PC?
Claims data Mac, observed data would definitely be PC. I can't even use a Mac. But I like the image.
Cat or dog?
Yeah. Cat, definitely. Cat.
Football or rugby?
Football.
Print or digital?
Print.
Ritson or Sharp?
Both.
Can't believe you dodged that one. Theresa May or Brian May?
Neither. I've balanced the last one up, yeah.
Now, before we dive into your book, I'm keen to know your background. So, 2 questions to kick us off. What was your first job and what was your first proper job?
So first ever job, I had quite a few random summer jobs, was probably bagging manure for a local farm. I did all sorts of stuff like glass collecting. I was I dressed up as Mr. Blobby for children's parties, door-to-door sales, all sorts of random jobs. But then, the first proper one was a media planner working at an agency called Visium, or BBJ actually at the time. And I was there for 4 or 5 years before going to Zenith.
And the tragic story of Kitty Genovese was rather pivotal moment for you.
Yes. So one of the clients that I was working on when I went over to Zenith, this was about 2004, was the blood service. And I can remember I was stuck in a taxi and we'd had a slightly bad client meeting. Results hadn't gone very well. And as I was on the way back, I was midway through reading The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. And at the back of that book, he tells the story of Kitty Genovese. So she was a bar worker in New York, and early as March 1964, was it March 13th, 1964, she's on her way home. She parks her car about 100 yards from her house, and then unfortunately, on the walk to the front door, she's spotted by a man called Winston Moseley. And as she's walking those last few yards, Moseley attacks her, stabs her, and kills her. Now, within a few days, this is front page news on the New York Times, which might not sound surprising because it's brutal murder. But in that year, there were 636 other murders, and none of them made the front page of the Times. And the reason this one made the front page was that supposedly, it definitely is a supposedly 37 other people saw that attack and did nothing to intervene. So what the New York Times interpreted it as was just a symptom of a kind of moral decay of the city. They were shocked that so many people could witness this attack and do nothing. But there were 2 psychologists, Bibb Latin and John Darley, who heard about the exact same incident and thought the Times had got it the wrong way around. That it wasn't that no one helped despite so many witnesses, it was that no one helped because there were so many witnesses. They argued there was a diffusion of responsibility among the crowd. And then over the next few years, they ran lots of different experiments. Good psychologists didn't just argue their point about diffusion of responsibility from a theoretical perspective. They set up a huge amount of experiments to try and prove their points. They'd get a colleague to pretend to have an epileptic fit, for example. They'd stage an emergency, and then they would monitor to see if strangers came to that colleague's aid. And they set those emergencies up so that either they were viewed by one person or a group of people. And their key finding was that people were up to twice as likely to help if they saw that person, or if they were on their own when they saw that person. So the psychologists coined a phrase called the bystander effect, the idea that if you ask for help, the more people you ask, the less likely any one individual is to come to your aid. Now, if you go back to 2004, when I first read about this, on the blood service, I remember thinking, good God, this is exactly the problem that we face. We are going out and asking everyone to donate blood, and just as Latimer and Dahl suggests, most people are ignoring us. So having read about that, I went and spoke to the creative agency, a lovely agency called DLKW, great strategist down there called Charlie Snow, and said to them, look, why don't we just make a really, really small tweak to the creative? Stop going out and saying blood stocks are low in England, please donate, and instead say blood stocks are low in Birmingham or Brentwood or Basildon. And that very small tweak, but one that was aimed at overcoming a specific psychological hurdle. When we saw the results in a couple of weeks' time, we saw that they had improved by 10-15%. Now that to me was a bit of a revelation. Up till then, working in an agency, people just weren't talking about, or certainly in media agency I was working, they weren't talking about psychology. They were, if ever discussed, it was just dismissed as this irrelevant, pointy-headed academic stuff. But here, albeit on a very small scale, was a example where we could take a well-known psychological finding, take it over to a problem our clients are facing, and see a very, very tangible improvement.
And you did see that improvement?
Yeah. 15%. I mean, it was 15 years ago. Like I say the exact number, 10 to 15% was the rough improvement in terms of cost per response. And then that kind of got me hooked from there. I thought, well, if there's this one experiment, are there others? And of course, anyone with a past knowledge will know that psychology is not just the bystander effect, it's hundreds and hundreds of experiences and biases. And if you immerse yourselves in those, the great thing with that range of experiments is that there will be an experiment out there, an insight out there that it won't necessarily solve the exact challenge you've got, but it'll get you some way to solve it. It'll give you a different angle to approach it. So it's a phenomenally relevant topic, I think, behavioural science and social psychology.
Absolutely. And do you think that the industry is more receptive to having that conversation now than perhaps when you first read this story?
Oh, absolutely. I still don't think it's receptive enough. I think we should be spending half our time talking about psychology and how we use it. But there's been a noticeable change since that 2004. And I think Kahneman winning the Nobel Prize, Kahneman publishing Thinking Fast and Slow, which has now sold over 2 million copies. Rory Sutherland's work with the IPA, Thaler again winning another Nobel Prize for his work in behavioural science, behavioural economics. All of that, I think, has gradually just led to an increasing interest from clients. And I've certainly noticed in the last 18 months or 2 years, a significant increase of clients coming and saying, can you solve this from a behavioural science angle? And I think what we'll see is once more and more clients do that, agencies will follow the money and they will begin offering more and more of these services. I think we'll see a virtuous circle. Yeah,
agreed. And likely be much more effective because of it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. All psychology is the also psychology behavioural is the study of why humans make the decisions they do. It seems almost ridiculous to kind of question the effectiveness of anything. But what we're trying to do as marketers is change people's decisions. We're trying to get them to spend a bit more with our brand, buy a brand more regularly, switch from a competitor, pay a premium, whatever it is. All of that's behaviour change. So, why wouldn't you draw on this 120-year study of what makes for efficient behaviour change? It's hard to think of a more relevant topic.
Agreed. I think, in truth, sadly, most marketers are at least some part magpie, and we seem to be attracted to the latest sparkly piece of technology and approach problems back to front, cart before the horse too often.
Yes, yeah, I think you're right on that. I think there is a fascination with the latest new thing. I think people are concerned about seeming old-fashioned,
Mm.
and sometimes if you come along to a meeting and start telling people about an experiment from the 1890s, I think they think you're insane. But there's that wonderful Bernbach quote of, it's fashionable to talk about the changing man, but as communicators, we should be concerned with the unchanging man. And all these biases, if they were genuine findings in the first place, they still work today. The fundamentals of human nature, which were probably shaped by eons of evolution, aren't changing in 10, 15, 20, 100 years.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Something I never tire of discussing myself is the pratfall effect. Can you explain a bit about this and its application in marketing?
Yes. So it's the idea. It was a phrase. So pratfall firstly means a small blunder in kind of American, I think it's slang, and it was an idea coined by Elliot Aronson, who was a Harvard professor in the 60s. And in 1966, he runs this experiment where he gets one of his colleagues to take part in a quiz, gives the guy the answers to the quiz. So he does amazingly well. It's 92% of the questions right, wins the quiz by miles. But then as the quiz is finishing, he makes a small blunder. He stands up and he spills a cup of coffee down himself. Now, Aronson has recorded all of that, and then he takes that recording and plays it to people. But he plays it in one of two versions. Either people hear everything and say he found a great performance, or just the great performance. And then Aronson quizzes them on, or questions them on how appealing they find this contestant. And on all the metrics of appeal, the contestant is found to be significantly more appealing if people have heard the mistake as well as the great performance. So he coins this idea, the pratfall effect, essentially the idea that people or products who exhibit a flaw become more appealing.
And can you give us any examples of any known brands who have taken advantage?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things here is, that experiment was 1966. If you go back 7 years earlier, so before he did that experiment, 7 years beforehand, Bernbach was applying this bias. Great creatives, great observers of human nature have often realised some of these insights already. So I think the Bernbach line was a small admission gains a great acceptance. And you can see that in two of the great DDB campaigns.
It's Avis.
You see it Avis, so admitting they're unpopular essentially. We're number two, so we try harder. VW that admitted the Beetle was both slow and ugly. Ugly is only skin deep. America's slowest fastback. So again and again, that age, they have some phenomenally successful campaigns around it. But you run through some of the best ad campaigns ever. You could easily do a list of the 10 best. There's obviously an element of subjectivity there, and you could argue, well, VW, Avis, Guinness, good things come to those who wait, admitting it's slow. Stella, reassuringly expensive, admitting it's highly priced. Listerine, the taste you hate twice a day, admitting it tasted awful. It'd be wrong to say it's a commonly used tactic. Now, I've done experiments where I've looked at the proportion of ads in a newspaper or series of newspapers using the pratfall effect, and it's a tiny, tiny percent. But if you look at it in terms of the best ever adverts, a large number have used the pratfall effect.
And perhaps lesser known, but given A, you've been in Amsterdam recently, and B, it's a personal favourite, it'd be wrong not to mention the Hans Brinker hotels.
Oh gosh, yeah. If people don't know that one, is it Kessel's Kramer? I think the agency. I might have pronounced that. I've got the wrong. It's an amazing campaign. Definitely worth googling.
I think it was maybe free wireless available with the neighbour's password or something.
That's right. Yeah, that's an amazing one. And there's some very crude ones as well. Now more dog shit in the entrance or something along those lines.
But that's a good point, though. So is the pratfall effect in part down to humour, in as much as we typically remember things which are funny or at least, witty?
Yeah, I think one of them, there's never one single reason. I think there's all life's kind of shades of grey and complexity. I think you're absolutely right that admission of a flaw gives you great humorous potential. You look appealing. I think there's also elements of one of the big hurdles, probably only secondary to noticeability, is probably believability. And most people think advertisers are either partial to the truth at the best or lying. So If you go out and admit a flaw, you have tangibly admitted a weakness. Sorry, you've tangibly demonstrated your honesty, and therefore all your other claims become more believable. There's also an argument of if you look at those great campaigns, they didn't just pick a weakness randomly. They also are very careful. They pick a weakness that has a mirror strength. So you go out and say, yes, we taste awful, as Listerine or Buckley's, probably an even better example, a Canadian mouthwash. You go out and say you taste awful, but then the mirror strength of that is people assume, well, bad tasting medicines are normally pretty potent. So you're tapping into a strength at the same time. So I think there's a number of reasons why it works so well.
Could you even argue that someone like Boris Johnson has built his entire career on affections won via the pratfall effect, but he's probably also demonstrated a tipping point where he's just become a prat?
Well, absolutely. So with all these experiments, there's normally a initial experiment, and then there are experiments looking at some of the nuances. So a couple of the nuances of the experiment. One by a lady called Kay Doan. I think this is a single experiment, so you've got to treat it with a bit of caution. Mm-hmm. She found that men, for example, were more prone to being swayed by the pratfall effect. Aronson, which from what we know might explain some of the categories they've used it, certainly historically. The second one was Aronson himself found the pratfall effect was very effective if people had a existing credibility. If they didn't have that credibility, it can actually backfire. So in one of his variants of the experiment, he gets the contestant to get most of the questions wrong. The contestant gets 35% of the questions right, looks a bit thick, and then makes the mistake. And in that scenario, when he plays out those two versions of the clip, if people have heard the poor performance and the mistake, they think he's less appealing than if they just hear the poor performance. So I mean, with Boris Johnson, that might well be true. That while he was, while people were maybe judging it, or maybe while they were judging him on non-political matters, his command of English language and his wonderful ability to come up with crazy anecdotes and analogies. When he's making mistakes there, it's very quite charming and bolsters him. Maybe when he's associated with some more high-profile policy failures, suddenly that sense of confidence is lost and no longer so charming. There might also be them actually. I mean, the other one is, and this is, I think Rory Sutherland makes this argument. He says, look, everyone thinks people are flawed or brands are flawed. So if you don't go out and tell people where your flaw lies, it's not that people think you're flawless. It's that they don't know where the flaw lies and they worry it might lie somewhere important. So if you go out and admit a flaw in an unimportant area, then you're kind of protecting yourself. And maybe, I don't know, go on.
That represents a very nice bridge into a discussion around reviews, really. We wrote a piece recently on a company who we have, presumably was founded in the pre-digital review age because they're called one-star tyre fitters. But am I right in thinking that 5-star average reviews, for that very reason you've just mentioned around Rory's points, aren't therefore as beneficial as, say, a 4.2 or a 4.3 review?
Yes, absolutely. So it does depend on the category. There is a lovely study, a real-world study by Northwestern University, 111,000 reviews, and what they find is that they cross the score of the review, 1 being awful, 5 being perfect, with likelihood to then go and purchase that good. And for 22 product categories, they see the same broad pattern. As the review gets better, people become more likely to purchase. But then at some stage, it does depend by category, between 4.2 and 4.5 out of 5. At some stage in that window, likely to purchase peaks. And then if the review gets any better, likely to purchase declines. Their argument, as you said, is that perfection is too good to be true. People know from bitter experience there are always trade-offs. They just don't trust it.
We, one of our clients, funny enough, an independent optician, we had a conversation around this because they were alarmingly receiving a significant majority of 5-star reviews, and we couldn't get them to drop their service sufficiently to bring it slightly down to something that was more believable.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'd ever recommend something worse. I mean, I think it's more that some people might well be being a bit, dodgy, and they'll only put on the perfect reviews, and they think they're making their case more persuasive, but actually, to grade it, because as I say, people know that nothing's perfect. What they ideally want to see is they spot a bad review, go and look at that, and if they see the reason for rejecting the product is one that wouldn't affect them, then, or they don't see as consequential, then it probably will make them more likely to go on a purchase. Because as I say, they know there's going to be a problem out there, but if they're aware that it's only in a minor area, it can set their mind at ease.
Absolutely. If they know what that might be, then it's much easier to anticipate the service that you're likely to receive were you to purchase.
Yeah. And the other bit I like about that review study is there's a criticism sometimes of behavioural science or social psychology that this is based on what's called a weird subject. It's based on students at Harvard and Cornell. What can we really extrapolate from that? And it's called weird because it stands for Western, educated, industrialised, rich, and democratic. This is where the sample's coming from. But if you then look, that might have been a more cutting attack in the 1960s or 1970s. But a lot of the really famous experiments the last 10 or 15 years are done often without people knowing they're in the experiment, like that review study or Cialdini's tau study. And they're done using observed data in the real world amongst a representative group. So that validity is not limited to laboratory studies. It works just as much in the real world.
Can you tell our listeners about, again, something that we increasingly talk about, not least when we're discussing media with our clients, which is signalling theory? Now, one of our favourite examples is from Bob Hoffman, they often are, who explains, imagine you walk into a crowded room and announce you're the most attractive person in the room. You've declared one thing, but you've actually signalled something entirely different, that you're a bit of a twat. So,
yes, yeah,
is that right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think he has a wonderful way with words. I think it's kind of essentially the idea that Jeremy Bullmore and Stephen King came up with in the 70s, that too many, and I would recommend, there's an amazing book called More Bullmore, which is a collection that Walk did of Bullmore's articles, and that I think is one of the best books in advertising. And sorry, in that, Bullmore, and I think drawing on Stephen King's work, talks about the input model versus the output model. And he says, look, too many people believe that what matters is what you say. But of course, what matters is what the audience take in. So, as Bob Hoffman said, you say one thing, the audience takes out almost the polar opposite. And I think that is still something, even though it's recognised 40 odd years ago, that hampers advertising. That there is too much of a emphasis on the kind of transmission of a message rather than the interpretation of the message that actually happens. And it's the interpretation that can be shaped by the media context, the signalling that you mentioned, the pratfall effect in essence. I mean, the pratfall effect is a kind of walking example of the problems with believing that output model. In outwardly, you're transmitting a mistake. What's coming in, what people are interpreting, though, is that you are human and approachable and appealing. So, yeah, it can be a dangerous model that sends us in the wrong direction.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, because I increasingly find, and reading through the Choice Factory and your studies and finding, I find they're almost 9-part signalling and 1 part pratfall in some instances. They're rarely exclusively one thing at play.
Oh, absolutely. So on one hand, what you see, and there are some experiments where they start running multiple biases in one go, and they see a cumulative effect. And there's some nice, some lovely ones around scarcity and anchoring being used at the same time. The only thing I think to watch out there is that with that multiple use of biases is the experience when you go on some of these travel booking sites, and they'll be using hundreds of biases all at the last time in a very kind of shouty manner. Most popular destination, people like you, only 3 seats, 27 people are looking at this right now. Deal expires in 3 hours, 46 seconds. If what I find interesting there is that is almost it's a bit of a literal-minded application, I think, of behavioural science, or maybe even it's more importantly, it's probably being measured in the wrong way. So what's probably happening there is people are throwing all these biases on, looking at immediate conversion to sale and seeing improvements. What they're probably not doing is looking at longer-term effect on what people perceive to be the brand. If you create such a negative, unpleasant, unappealing experience, the danger is you're destroying your brand equity. And I think with these biases, there's just tools, and you still need to use your nous and common sense and judgment in how you apply them. And on occasion, for all marketing, it's worth walking away from a short-term improvement in metrics to shore up your longer-term performance.
Yes, absolutely. Well, a nod to Burnett and Field there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm slightly alarmed that we've talked about signalling without mentioning peacocks.
Oh, yeah.
Which I've never managed to do.
No, I love the peacock example. I think, so if people aren't aware of the peacock example, there's this wonderful letter from Charles Darwin, I think in the 1860s, to a lady called Asa Gray. And he says, the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. The idea being, at that stage, he found it perplexing that how could this bird with a giant cumbersome tail exist in a world of natural selection? And that kind of puzzle, I think, was fully solved in the 70s by a man called Amos Zahavi. And he argued that it was the very cost of that tail, the increasing probability of being caught by a predator, that made it a powerful and genuine signal to mates. His argument being that only a bird with phenomenal hunting skills, genetic strength, ability to evade predators could get away with such a long tail, a cumbersome tail. So it's signal to mates your genuine genetic strengths. So his argument was costly signals that can't be imitated and faked by peacocks in that sense of lower ability, genuinely have more credibility amongst an audience.
Yeah.
And then academics like John Kay and Evan Davis, I think, argued that this works in advertising as well. And advertising spend, first of all, shows a confidence in your brand, because most of that value will be recouped in the long term. So only a brand that is confident of their good being so good that you've got to return again and again and again would bother advertising. And then the extrapolation from that as well. The more extravagant the advertising, the greater creative hoopla, the double page spreads, the 3-minute ads, the huge sponsorships, all of that is signalling a genuine confidence in the brand that acts as a screening mechanism between confident and unconfident brands.
And the key part often is the waste as much as it might be the expense. I think a great example again from Rory Sutherland is that if it was solely the expense without the wastefulness, then the young glitterati would drive around London in Arctic lorries, not flash sports cars. Because they're so impractical and cannot possibly be used at their intended purpose. The sports car is obviously the one that's opted for that signalling reason.
Yes, absolutely. And there are some lovely examples about that waste through history. I mean, there are indigenous societies, there were indigenous societies in the USA, in Northwest America, where they'd have, I think, potlatch, where they would set fire to huge amounts of possession. I mean, these were, they were signals of wealth because, as you say, it was entirely wasteful. It's it's an interesting observation that I think works beyond advertising in many different areas. But again, going back to that measurement problem, if you just optimise the short term, you end up in kind of problematic areas because you start stripping out the waste. And to begin with, it all looks amazing. You don't notice any of the problems, but over time, you see a long-term degradation of the brand equity.
There's so much around signalling to love, not least it gives us indisputable logic against so much digital misuse, which I think sadly rife in our industry. And a key point being how we inherently trust messages which are broadcast indiscriminately to large audiences.
Yes.
Versus the direct one-to-one nature of a lot of the digital channels, which admittedly might be highly targeted. And there's a quote in your book which I absolutely love from Louis Heron, the foreign correspondent at the time.
Oh yeah, Times, yeah.
When a politician tells you something with confidence, always ask yourself, quote, "Why is this lying bastard lying to me?"
I mean, it's logical. I mean, for taking that analogy to brands, people know that brands have got a vested interest to paint the best picture of reality. So why would they trust them? So it's an important metric to be concerned with and trying to overcome. I did a thought experiment. I don't think it's in the book. I think in fact it's not in the book. I haven't published it yet. But we did a survey where I can't remember the exact results, but they're broadly right. Half the people were told, "Look, imagine you're chatting with an MP, and the MP promises that they're going to increase the investment in speed cameras by 10% next year. How likely it is, do you think, he's telling the truth?" And what we found is, I think it was about 40% of people think that the MP is lying. We then did, and I think I should have said, emphasise that you're in a one-to-one meeting with this guy. We then do another thought experiment where we say exactly the same thing, but the MP is talking in front of a crowd of you and 99 other people. And in that scenario, the proportion of people who think the MP's lying drops by about half. So no one's comparing two side by side, but when we put national representative groups into those two different thought experiments, you see a wildly different performance or belief in the message, because people are picking up on the fact that it is much more costly to lie in front of lots of people than to lie on a one-to-one basis. So yes, it's not necessarily digital versus traditional. I think it is. Yeah, it's broadcast versus personalised. That a claim that is made and people know that other people have seen it, outdoor being the kind of medium par excellence, has a greater trust and credibility.
At a risk of exposing myself as someone who merely regurgitates wiser people's wisdom, I think it's too late for that really, but Rory Sutherland again gave a wonderful, if slightly daft example recently, which was when we get married, we say our vows in front of all of our family and friends, often in large public spaces. We don't go door to door.
Yes, I mean, Rory Sutherland has an amazing gift for her analogies. Yeah, I think it's absolutely, absolutely true. Now, what's interesting though is and I haven't got around to publishing this either, so this is another one that needs to get in gear and get out quite quickly. Is there is a belief amongst marketers that the problem of trust, like low trust in brands, is a new thing. And again, that's based on 500 odd people marketers have surveyed. Vast majority think trust in brands is declining. There is no evidence for that at all. All the long-term tracking metrics of trust show that people don't trust businesses or brands or CEOs, but then they never have done. So the danger with this belief that trust is in decline is that you think, okay, so it's a new crisis, it's a new problem, we therefore need a completely new solution. That's not the case. The same tactics that worked, for religion, for marriages, for brands through the years, the successful tactics that once worked to build trust like admitting a weakness, like making public commitments, like costly signalling, they will still work today. And it goes back to your point earlier about this, bizarre love of what it's almost a narcissism. I think this belief that we live in the hardest and most dangerous and most problematic of times as marketers. Therefore we must be, far, far better than our predecessors because we have to deal with them. And it's just not true.
On that note, a particular favourite of mine from the book is actually Goodhart's Law. Can you talk a little bit around that?
Oh, okay, yeah. So Goodhart's Law, sometimes called the Cobra effect. It's essentially the idea that if there is a sliver of difference between the metric that you've set as a target and the underlying objective, then you end up with unintended consequences. So it should actually probably be called the rat effect rather than the Cobra effect, because there's more historical evidence for the kind of an example with rats. And it was back in 1902, Hanoi governor realises an outbreak of bubonic plague, wants to try and reduce volume of deaths, so wants to kill lots of rats, doesn't have a large team at his disposal, so he says to the public as a whole, every time you kill a rat, you bring in a tail, give it to me, or one of my colleagues probably, and we'll pay you a certain amount of money. Now, that's him setting a target to solve a problem. And what first happens is it looks like that is working brilliantly. Kind of sets this task in early spring, I think. March is getting a couple of hundred tails a day. May, it's thousands. And it actually peaks in June. And on a single day, 20,000 tails are handed into the governor. What then becomes transparent as getting into summer is, although the metric looks phenomenally successful, there's more and more tails being handed in, the underlying objective of dead rats is not working. There is no, people are seeing just as many rats as they always have. It just so happens that a lot of those rats are now tailless. And what the governor finds on further investigation is he has kind of unlocked the ingenuity of the population as a whole. Rather than hunting down and killing rats, what people have been doing is capturing rats, breeding rats, lopping the tails off rats, pretty much doing everything but killing a rat, because that's just too much of a waste of money. So he then makes a change of policy and says, okay, no longer am I giving people a bounty for rats' tails. And unfortunately, that has another unintended consequence. People just release the rats onto the street because they no longer have any value to them. So he's trying to set a target that is not exactly the same as the underlying objective, creates these unintended consequences. And on one hand, it's remarkable through history how many times that very, very similar problem has occurred, with rats in Vietnam, cobras in Delhi, wild pigs in America. Yet there are also strong parallels with marketing. The parallel here being the underlying thing we want is long-term sustainable, profitable growth. What ends up getting measured, though, and therefore optimized to, is a proxy, and there's a sliver of difference between the proxy and the underlying metric. The proxy tends to be short-term sales metrics, click-through rates, immediate purchase, and unfortunately, people therefore put all their efforts in those elements, look successful for a few years, and then, as you say, the Binet and Field show, by ignoring the longer term, they start to reap the problems a couple of years down the line.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much is murky around attrition, and again, that story shows how easy it is for data to be misinterpreted. The idea that because two trends move in the same direction, it doesn't mean the first caused the second, or the second might have caused the third, the first, or there may even be a third at play. So, and on that note, to kind of take a sidestep into another area that I find particularly frustrating, which is the one around brand purpose. I think you made a wonderful point about Jim Stengel's book Grow, which is a wonderful piece, but I think that you did highlight, or have highlighted, some potential flaws in the claims around brand purpose. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. So, it's a chapter in the book. It's a slightly different one from many of the others in that probably the research into purpose came first. And then I've put it in the book as a chapter around wishful seeing. So it's an idea from Brunner and Goodman, back in the 1940s, that people don't see reality as it is. They see what they want to see. And my argument was maybe purpose is one of those examples, because it is a very popular idea. But if you probe the studies, and it doesn't take long to do the probing, if you probe the studies, you start to see they very quickly fall apart. And one of the studies I looked at in real depth was Stengel's. And actually, at first I was quite dismissive. I've actually grown to admire him a lot more as a person, because what he does, which I think is very honourable and a very good thing to do, is he publishes all his data, he publishes his methodology, he publishes his appendices. So he is completely open with his data and research. And I think that's a very, very admirable thing. And it is not always done. But because he does that, you can actually see a lot of the flaws with the methodology. So you can see that the definitions of brands having a purpose is very, very woolly. So, for example, he'll say Moet and Chandon, the purpose is to turn a drink into a celebration, or blackberries to connect people. And what you then realise is, well, wait a minute, if we're claiming these brands have had a massive success in the stock market, and that's his underlying central theme, what we then say, well, he's got this collection of 50 brands that have done amazingly well in the stock market, and he says that their consistent factor is all having a brand purpose. How people are using that term of brand purpose is very different to the actual definitions in the appendix. The appendix is essentially just a description of a product. How people use brand purpose is to say it has this higher kind of moral purpose. So, there's quite a few examples there of, also look at the performance of these stocks that supposedly do so well because they have a brand purpose and they revert to the mean, and look at some of the kind of data discrepancies. And if you probe into it, I don't think that anyone would seriously argue any longer that is a robust research that proves brand purpose in any way. But what's fascinating is that data, there are lots and lots of examples like this in marketing, that something, a research paper, that the headline finding is taken, it's used by thousands and thousands of marketers and millions of pounds are spent behind it, yet with a little bit of digging, you can see that the data is flawed. But why does this happen again and again? Myths about millennials being wildly different. Ipsos have done some great data to show that's just not the case. Trust in brand declining. If you dig through, again, some work by Ipsos, if you dig through the footnotes of the Edelman reports, you see it's just not true. Brand purpose, again, there's so little evidence. But I think we are guilty as an industry of taking a headline finding and not taking the time and effort to probe into the underlying data.
I also think there's a case, particularly on the brand purpose point, of a lot of marketers are slightly ashamed to be marketers, which is why they come up with these crazy job titles of growth hackers and gurus and digital wizards and so on and so forth. So having the idea of having a bigger purpose, of course, is something that drives all of us on a human level. But actually, it's dangerous to allow that to creep into what you're preaching as a business. I mean, the recent example of the recent Gillette ad is a great example, and we could spend a whole podcast debating that one in particular. But I think that in that instance, the message is fantastic, but I think there's a lot around the authenticity of who's saying it and their behaviour as a company, which causes you to think, well, actually, are you just saying are these words founded on anything real?
Absolutely. So there's a few things that have to be kind of uncoupled. I think the first is in that case, I suppose, asking men to behave in a basic, decent human manner, is that a good thing? Well, wanting people to behave in that way is of course a sensible thing. So you have to put that to one side. There's then is it something sensible to advertise? Is that the best way to sell razors? And then it becomes a little bit more uncertain, because there is an opportunity cost to having that message rather than another. And I think the one of the problems is does a company, what right does Gillette have to preach to people and patronise them? Potentially, that's going to irritate people. And then secondly, as you say, well, is it a genuine belief, or is there something slightly cynical about jumping on a very important social movement to shift a few razor blades? Is that slightly cynical? And I think there's a Mark Ritson article where he says, look, to know whether you should have a purpose, ideally it's, was that thing that you're arguing fundamental to your company's kind of setup? Did you believe in this, and was it run through your company from top to bottom before you started advertising? If so, you have a brand purpose. If not, there will be dangerous charges of hypocrisy about to rise. So you can see why the Body Shop going for a kind of purpose-driven approach, that is true to their core. That's a kind of a very sensible tactic. Whether it is for Gillette is a slightly different matter. I certainly haven't seen studies and evidence that give us any proof that purpose is a business tactic that generates better success than other approaches. It's one of those topics where the world seems to be divided in two camps, and whatever you say to one camp, or whatever you say to either camp, I guess, they won't be. I don't think they'll be persuaded. It's an example of confirmation bias.
Yeah, and there's so much. The word context has come up a few times. There's so much context to take into consideration with anything. And going back to your reference to Mark Ritson's article, again, I don't think he's made the same point directly to P&G, but it's still applicable, which is I'd much rather they just paid their taxes than focused on purpose. But that,
I think that's a very interesting point, in that there's third time of saying a principle isn't a principle to cost you money. One of my frustrations would be that many of the kind of topics that brands are getting involved in are costless. All it is fodder for a TV ad. You go back to the original brand's purpose, people like Cadbury's and Quakers, and their whole mission, everything they did, they're paying people decent wage, setting up model villages, all these areas. They didn't just pronounce their virtue on big posters. They, gave away phenomenal parts of their wealth to make these things happen. That is purpose, and it's an interesting way. You want to see action, not just costless signalling. So I think that is a very fair point.
Absolutely. I'm wary that we're heading deep into extra.
Yeah, and then sorry, I probably should say, because I feel like I maybe jumped straight to the criticism of purpose without giving the facts. It's probably worth saying. I think there is a chapter of the book called Wishful Thinking, and I think that's published. I pretty much gave the chapter free to Mumbrella, or a kind of cut down of the chapter. So if people want to see the line by line critique of the Stengel stuff and the data behind it, and that my data is, go to Mumbrella, because otherwise I wouldn't want to be guilty of just spouting off on that topic.
No, of course not, and I didn't back you into a corner there.
But I think I jumped straight to the criticism rather than the actual evidence.
I think that article was from last summer, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. I think it was around that. I think that's right. Yeah, but Mumbrella, purpose, wishful thinking, people will be able to find it.
Now, if there's time, assuming there's time, I wanted to talk very briefly, because, as I say, there's rich pickings in the book, but around placebos, simply because I'm a huge fan of placebos, and I, as yet, don't understand why someone hasn't taken them more seriously.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating for a couple of reasons. So, essentially, the idea of the placebo effect, you see it on painkillers, that it's the expectation of something working. If people expect it to be a very strong medicine, it's more likely to have an effect. And Anton de Crane, I think it was, did a systematic review, 12 studies, and he found, so not just a one-off, this is looking at a much broader analysis, multiple studies, much greater validity. Looks at 12 studies and looks at the effect of colour on painkillers' effectiveness. So exactly the same medication or lack of medication, and he found red painkillers were more effective than blue painkillers. The argument being red has cultural connotations of strength and efficacy. So you get this, I think that as a headline factor is kind of reasonably well known. Two interesting areas are firstly, like all these biases, when you start to dig into them, that's when they get really interesting. And the interesting thing about placebo effect is the nuance to it. That it's not just that it exists, it's that it exists with kind of quite a few varieties. So, for example, you've got the colour has an effect, the taste, the worse tasting, the stronger it will be perceived to be. The size of the pill can have an effect. Whether it's an injection of saline solution versus a sugar pill will have an effect. Anything that makes it feel like a bigger intervention, regardless if the active ingredient's the same, it will have a larger medical effect. So you've got this lovely level of nuance. It's one interesting bit to it. The second bit I find fascinating is how rarely it's used. So I did this when I look at a book, and probably should go out and do it again with a greater sample, but I was worried I was just splashing my cash. I went out and got lots of painkillers, and I found that only 1 in 7 painkillers had used red. Most were white. So what you're seeing is almost 85% of the market-ish are ignoring a well-known, proven finding. They are relying on solving people's medical problems by active ingredient, not maximising the effect of the active ingredient by harnessing the placebo effect. So I find it fascinating that you can still get phenomenal creative advantage, commercial advantage from applying very well-known findings.
And in that example, at what you must assume would be a fairly trivial comparative cost to make the pills red in that instance.
I should certainly not a chemist, but I can't believe that colouring a pill red on a production run of millions would cost presumably cost virtually nothing. Yet it's not used, and I think we see these instances again and again. Not if it was just pills, maybe there's something pharmaceutical about it, but we see it again and again that work from behavioural science is not applied as widely as it should be. And I think one of the problems is this underlying belief in marketing that we can understand customers or people's motivations by asking them directly. And the problem is, if you go and ask someone, does the pill have any effect on you? Colour. Of course, they'll say no. If you go to people and say, does knowing that this is a popular product affect you in any way? They'll swear blind it doesn't. And too many brands ask people directly what motivates them. They take those claims at face value, and therefore they end up with completely the wrong approach.
Which I think is again, if we go back to your book, The Choice Factory, I think most people on the street would probably deny the existence of most of the theories within.
Absolutely, yeah. Or if you ask them, do they think other people are affected by these biases? They would. Yeah. They might have a very different answer. Yeah.
Yes. We're going to move on to a listener question, if we may.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Asking the general public for input on anything is notoriously fraught with danger, be it Brexit or boat names, but we haven't let that stop us. So a friend of Gasp, Mark, has asked if you have any recommendations on the process of actually writing a book.
Well, I didn't really think about this in the time until I think I was chatting with Charlie Snow, who I mentioned at the beginning, a lovely strategist who was at DLKW. And what he said is, I like how you apply chunking to the writing process to make it simpler. And I thought, God, that actually did happen without me making and doing it on any way purposefully, which was the book was a lot easier to write than I think having a single idea with a single thread running through it. It is essentially 25 standalone chapters, and I can remember writing them pretty much one a week. By the end of that week, I was thoroughly sick to death of that bias, and I was really excited to be starting a new one. So if you can chunk it up in any way, that would, I think, make the whole process of writing a book much easier.
Wow, I was expecting you to tell me how hard it was to write and that you would never write another one, but you did hint earlier that there's another book in progress.
No, I mean, I must admit, bizarrely, I'd actually started writing the second one before the first one had been published. But since it's come out, I've got a bit behind, so I haven't progressed it any further. But I definitely will do. Definitely will do a second.
Well, now you can consciously chunk.
Yes, yeah. And if sorry, when I say chunk, and if people don't know the phrase chunking, essentially splitting up a big task into lots of little bits.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, we should have clarified that. What advice would you give to your younger self, Richard?
I think I would, worry a lot less. I was always kind of very concerned when I first started out about what clients would think, and maybe, or what might happen if I took a risk. And there's a lovely phrase which is attributed to Churchill, but probably someone else said.
They normally are.
Yeah. There's a lovely phrase again. Secondly, called Churchillian drift, which is the idea that a person with limited fame makes a quote, and then it gets attributed gradually to more and more famous people until it ends up with Churchill. It's called Churchillian drift.
That's wonderful.
But hopefully in this case it's a genuine Churchill one. But it's the thing along those lines. I've had a lot of trouble in my life, most of which has never happened. So I think I think if I was doing it all again, I'd just be a lot more. I'd take more risks, do things more quickly rather than being kind of cautious.
Yeah, good advice. And if you could banish one thing from the industry, and when I say industry, I mean particularly our world of marketing.
Yes.
What would that be, and why?
I think it would be this repeating of myths without looking at the data behind them. So whether that is the decline in trust, the deliverance of millennials, or brand purpose, as an industry, we've got to move away from taking headlines from magazines or journals or claims and repeating them without kind of interrogating the data. I think that would be one thing.
Yeah, okay. I was hoping you'd say Gary V, but that's fine. I'll accept that answer. And any books you can recommend to our listeners aside from The Choice Factory?
Of course. So I did do a post a while ago on 14, I think, psychology books I'd recommend. But I think some of them would be, there's a wonderful book called Irrationality by Richard Shotton, which is one of my favourites. I think if you're going to read a single book on psychology, that would be the one. Wonderful. I mean, one of the best things about the book, it fell out of print in the early 2000s, but it was in such high demand amongst people interested in the topic that it was selling for hundreds of pounds on eBay and other kind of second-hand sites. So I think that shows quite how valuable the stuff within it is. You don't have to pay £100 any longer. It's now being re-released in a second edition, but that is an amazing book, very easy to read, and has hundreds of psychology experiments and examples. So that, I think, is a phenomenal book.
Well, I've not read that.
Oh, yeah, go for that one.
And we always dedicate the show to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass that honour, depending on your point of view, to our guest. So over to you, Richard, on that one.
In the Choice Factory, I talk about a lot of experiments that I've done, but I never did those on my own. I was always massively helped by a kind of team of researchers. So there's probably far too many of them to mention, but the people who helped probably the most were Jenny Riddell, Claire Limford, Anna Candace and Rebecca Strong. So I would never have been able to write the book without their help. Those experiments. Sometimes they're a line in the book, but they would have been standing out on the street. I think Claire stood out on the street asking people how much they'd spent at Pret a Manger, for hours and hours on end. So I do owe those four and many others a huge debt of gratitude.
Yeah, it's easy to not even consider how some of the results are sorted.
Yeah. So, it's quite painful to write only a sentence about them when there's probably so much work went into setting them up and doing the questioning and surveying.
Okay, so well said. So as a final call to action, please everyone, if you've enjoyed even a snippet of this podcast, you'll adore Richard's book. So how can they get that, Richard, and how else would you encourage they get more Richard Shotton?
The book's available most websites, so you can get W. H. Smith or Watson's or Amazon. So the book's available easily in Audible, Kindle, whatever format you want it on. And essentially, I do particularly like the Audible because it's one of my oldest mates, who is an actor, has done the voiceover. So he's very good. Simon Cole's very good. doing the reading. Yeah. And then in terms of that, the other things I'm doing at the moment are I've just set up a day-long training course. So I'm going to try and do those every couple of months. There's one coming out, I think, on the 4th of March. So you can sign up for that. If you want details, just email me or tweet me on Twitter. And then the other thing, I suppose Twitter, I'll tweet at R Shotton. And I promise people they will not see pictures of my cat or what I'm eating for dinner tonight. It's so
you have
weird.
a cat, though.
I do have a cat. I have a cat called Ziggy. Yeah. Named after David Bowie. And yeah, sorry, I only tweet about social psychology and advertising. So if people are interested in the topic, if I ever read anything interesting in a book, I'll take a photo of that snippet and tweet it out. And I'm looking forward. I've got just read Dave Trott's new book, which is amazing, Creative Blindness. So I'll be tweeting a bit of that soon. And I'm also very excited. I've pre-ordered Rory Sutherland's book. I think it's called Alchemy. So when that's out, I'll be tweeting little snippets from that.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, for joining us. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And I hope our paths cross before our annual catch-up at Nudge Stock.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's the other one. If people are interested in this topic, Nudge Stock is amazing. So
I couldn't agree more.
Absolute steal. I think I should maybe we can cut this out at the end, but Ogilvy could easily charge twice as much. And I think, I would certainly pay, and I think most people would pay.
I'm going to edit that bit out, Richard.
Yeah, do. I won't be very popular if they do that. So I think it's 200 quid, and they can't be making that much money from it because they've got like Nobel Prize winners speaking. It's phenomenal. Every speaker on their list is great, so that I will always make it down for that.
It is, absolutely, and we're delighted that a speaker from one of the former Nudge Stock in both previous years has agreed to join us on the pod soon. So more on that soon.
Oh, you're keeping that secret, are you? Oh, okay.
He emceed last year and he spoke the year before, so that probably gives it away.
Oh, okay.
So no, fantastic. I've actually contacted them and requested that Rory has his own stage this year, but whether they act on that or not, I don't know.
I think you could easily have a kind of Rory stop, couldn't you, of a day in English talking. I'd be up for that. Yeah.
Oh, I would be too. But thank you once again, and thank you to everyone who's willingly let their ears be bent by us for the last hour or so. Don't forget to subscribe in the usual ways, and if you want to get in touch with the show, you can via our website, gasp4.com.
To action, I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.